Welcome everybody. We have a pretty good turnout tonight, and welcome also to our speaker, Professor Emily Combe from the University of Glasgow.
Thank you.
And she's from the School of Medicine, Dentistry, Nursing and Human Nutrition, according to their website, which I think must pretty well reflect her very multidisciplinary approach to her work and her research. So, which focuses on food and the impacts that this has, our diet has on health throughout life, from birth basically, I think, to old age. So she has a particular interest on the sort of farm to fork society and the implications for all stakeholders, from community, industry, clinical settings. And I think these days we're all a bit more aware of some of the problems that diet can cause us. So we're certainly hoping to find out a lot more tonight, and maybe some things that we can do for ourselves to improve our own diets. She is involved in many projects. Some are industry-led, others are funded by charities or government bodies. But most of them are applied and they have wide public health implications. So I think we should all learn quite a bit this evening. And if you could unmute yourself, please, Emily, we'll hand over to you.
Excellent. Thank you very much for this very kind invitation and very, very generous introduction as well. I'm going to try to share my screen and hopefully it should work if all goes well. Can you see the slides?
Yep.
Okay, super. So this is a University of Glasgow, the Cloisters. So I work at the university, sadly not on the main campus here, but at the Royal Infirmary, which is on the east of the city. I'm Professor of Human Nutrition there, and I work with a group of people who, like Claire described, are either clinician or working in industry or maybe in NGOs and so on. So my next slide gives you a little bit more about my disclosure. So just to kind of put that out there, first of all, my diet to start with. So I don't follow any particular diet. I eat pretty much anything without particular restriction. And I'm a member of various organizations. I've worked with public funding bodies, but also the industry, so various sources of funding, which may or may not influence what I'm going to present to you. We're always influenced by a number of things. I think it's a good thing to be aware of it when we speak about diet, but I think particularly culture, where you come from and what you eat is important in your perspective on the topic. So I'm also French, so I grew up in France. My food culture comes from here, but I spent the last 20 years in the UK, so there's a bit of both there. So without further ado, I want to launch into the topic. So the topic for tonight is diet and the life cycle. And the life cycle is very much this kind of journey from conception or even preconception, pregnancy, all the way to old age. And for nutritionists, it's a massive topic of interest because we know that a lot of what happens in that part of our life is set quite early in utero. So altogether, my research focuses on food, diet, the life cycle, but also health trajectory through life. And this is maybe more precisely described here in that picture, where we can see the key stages of life and those two main phases, the first one being optimal growth and development up to early adulthood, and then later on maintaining health and independence as we grow older. So my work broadly focuses on approaches and strategies that are aimed at reducing this gap in attaining a healthful long life. And really, if we think about of life, a topic which is quite close to my heart is the topic of stress as a very broad concept, and burden. And it might look a little bit like this picture. So some people transport quite small burdens and others have quite large burden to kind of carry through life, and this will influence how fast and how well they reach their destination. So we think about nutrition in the context of that burden and the life cycle. And this is maybe more clearly represented in that picture. So here we've got a slide that explains the burden at a global level in a bit more detail. So on the left, we've got the list of global burdens in 1990. So we can see that the first one was child wasting, we had short gestation, smoking, and safe water. And quite far down at the bottom, 11, we've got high fasting plasma glucose and high body mass index. So the 90s, I still think of it as fairly recent, but it's a wee while ago now, it's more than 20 years. When we look at the global burdens now in 2019, we can see that the list has changed, and high fasting plasma glucose has jumped up, and so has high body mass index. And that entirely reflects the dramatic changes that have happened in our food and environment. So we've got a big imperative to address those global burdens, as those are things that we can actually do something about. So from global to back into local, here we've got some data about Scotland and England. And here we're specifically looking at waist circumference of people living either in Scotland or in England. So we've got two surveys, Scottish Health Survey and the English Health Survey. And here we're only looking at, actually it's not women, it's men here. And we can see that we've got 3 panels. So that's a proportion of people with a small waist, proportion of people with a waist higher than 94 centimeter, which is risk level 1 for cardiovascular disease, and proportion of people with a waist circumference which is larger than 102 centimeter, which is risk level 2. And we can see that in orange, we've got the percentage of people in different age groups as it was in the 90s, and in greater figures as they were in the 2008, 2010. What we can see is basically the older we get, the smaller the proportion of people living with a small waist, which is associated with a healthier lifespan. And this is quite marked between what was in the 90s and what was in 2010. 8 and 10. So we've got a change in body composition, and this will translate into risk and potential comorbidities as we age. We can see that here the picture is quite similar between England and Scotland. The only difference is that in Scotland the survey is not fantastic, because the 94 one, we didn't have much data past 65 years, but that data was available in England. So increasing body composition, which reflects pretty much what we've seen in the news through life. The picture in women, so here that should be women, in women is similar, except that is potentially even striker. Women's waists have grown larger in the last couple of decades, and this is quite striking on the Scottish picture. So is it all because of what we eat? Is that the sole reason? And this was a picture that was used to advertise a seminar. And it represents so many things at the same time about what food is and isn't. So in this picture, we could choose to see enjoyment, pleasure, or we could even see stigma, food stigma, or even privilege of eating out, and so on. And often the discussions around food, diet, and nutrition focus simply on energy, calorie, fat, sugar, and maybe also salt. But there's a lot more about nutrition and health than those particular talking points. I'm not saying that they're not important, but there's much more to food and nutrition than those micronutrients. And here, I wanted to unpick this table from the National Diet and Nutrition Survey. We're looking at micronutrients intake, so what people eat, consume in women and in men, divided in different age groups. So we've got children, teens, young adult and older adult, and people aged 65 plus. And the numbers in the cell represent the proportion of people who are falling below the minimum threshold for adequate intake. So this is quite low. It's not the recommended one, it's a low one for sufficiency. And no number in those cells should be higher than 3%. And
no.
What we can see that is quite dramatic. So for example, in young people 11 to 18, we can see that a large proportion, nearly a quarter or more, do not eat enough of those nutrients, okay? So that's not great. We've got a problem here. It's linked to nutrition, nutritional balance, access to food. But we can see that it's not just the young people. For certain nutrients, there is some problems. So for example, Selenium, which is important for immunity. We know that it's not a nutrient that is secured very well from foods. It remains problematic. We've got for iron as well. We can see as well, we've got some data here for anemia, iron deficiency, low iron status. And that will not necessarily kill you in the UK, but it might make you quite unwell. And what might make you quite unwell when you're a child might have lifelong kind of consequences. Another nutrient of interest is iodine. Iodine is particularly important for metabolism, but it becomes critical during pregnancy. If the fetus is not exposed to enough iodine, then there will be potential consequences for neurodevelopment. Now, we've got a perspective in the UK that our diet is plentiful in terms of micronutrients, but it's not always the case. And it's a shame because there is a lot that could be done to improve the diet of the nation for lifelong benefit. Now, sadly, the type of solution we see is often this. So this is a picture from, I think it's a supermarket in France, but we see similar things in the UK. Shelves really well stacked with remedies, supplements, potions, either for topping up vitamins, minerals, or remedies for weight maintenance, for anti-oxidative stress, and so on. And this is a multi-billion-pound global business. But we know that the people who usually have the means to kind of buy those expensive products are not always the ones that need them the most. And that's potentially something that we need to address, these nutritional gaps. Beyond the fact that supplements are not always useful, there is some evidence that they could potentially not be healthful or supporting lifelong health. So here we've got figures that tells us about all-cause mortality in trials that test antioxidant supplements. So here we've got vitamin A, E, C, and selenium. Different type of trials, some with high risk of bias, some of low risk of bias. And we've got diamonds. So when a diamond hovers across this midline here, it means that there's no real difference between the antioxidant or the placebo. It doesn't really matter for all-cause mortality if you take it or not. And we can see that it's a case for 3 or 4 of those. But what we can see as well, that there's 4 diamonds here where placebo is actually potentially better than the antioxidant supplement. And that graph, that paper is part of quite a strong body of evidence that tells us, well, supplements are not necessarily good, but sometimes they can cause harm. So when we consider the investment in the supplement business and the size of the business globally, it makes us reflect on whether there is scope to do things differently in terms of achieving a diet plentiful in vitamins and minerals. And one of the approach that we followed at Glasgow is focusing on food reformulation. So food reformulation is when you take a staple food, so here we've got the basic pizza, and you modify, you tweak the recipe to improve the nutritional content. So we did this exercise with our partner, which is Eat Balanced, and we took the basic school dinner pizza and we transformed the recipe. So you can see that the crust is a little bit more brown than you would expect. The cheese is a little bit more sparse, switched for a low-fat cheese. The salt was reduced, the tomato passata was changed slightly. We included some secret ingredient so that the look and the taste of the pizza would not be changed and people would be put off by it. And this approach is called health by stealth. So we designed this pizza with a partner and we presented it to people. Would they buy it? Would they eat it? And the feedback was positive. It was an enjoyable product. Some people would even swap the new product for their habitual one, especially adults. Kids were kind of getting there. But when we asked them, how much more money would you pay for that improved, nutritionally balanced pizza with all the right vitamin and minerals in the right level to meet the school standards for all those things, it told us 50p. Sadly, when you retail a product like that in the supermarket, especially in partnership with a small business, the supermarket take a very big margin, and this is not a viable exercise for 50p margin. So the pizza went into supermarkets for a wee while, but was not on the shelves for very long because it was not working for the company. But at that point, our partner pivoted very rapidly and decided to distribute the pizza through schools, through council throughout the UK. And this has potentially enabled the product to reach a much greater number of kids, improving their diet by reducing salt, saturated fat, increasing fiber, and increasing those macronutrient intake. So a different delivery mode meant that nutrition could reach more people and not just those who could afford it by paying a little bit more in the supermarket. Now, we don't only have pizza to improve. There's a wide range of food that can be improved. And the strategies that we use to understand which food needs to be improved is called nutrient profiling, which very basically is a kind of number crunching exercise where you decide whether foods are good or bad, depending on threshold for specific nutrient. So this is a piece of work we did with colleagues in Nestle. And we looked at the food portfolio of the UK, France, China, Brazil, and we divided the food portfolio in those broad categories. So chocolate, dressing, small meals, soups, and so on. And we looked at the big suspects, so fat, salt, sugar, energy, but also calcium content. And we have here a ranking of food with the percentage showing being the percentage of good foods. So foods that are deemed good enough to pass through the sieve. Obviously, we can see that chocolates, whether in UK, France, China, or Brazil, very few chocolate products are actually good, mostly because it's a product based on sugar and fat. And we can see that side dishes, which are often based on vegetable, do improve. There's a large variation for each category, which means that there's a lot of scope to improve the food supply. And if reformulation is applied to all those foods and products, it means that a greater proportion of the population can benefit through this health by stealth approach. We don't make people do something, we replace and reformulate foods so that the benefit can reach everyone without them having to make a choice, and ideally without them having to pay extra for that improved product. So ultimately, foods are not the same things as meals, and diets are just or more than just meals. So when we talk about nutrition in the context of health and the life cycle, we need to look beyond just food. It's not just what you pick in the supermarket, it's the entire diet. And that's where it becomes a little bit more complicated, because defining diets is complex. Not everyone understands the same thing about it. Diets are more than just specific nutrients, specific fruit. It's a set of rules, maybe a protocol to follow over a certain amount of time. It's a body of evidence. Ideally, your diet has got a large evidence base where it's proven to work in different people in different walks of life. It's a personal goal. Some people diet for weight, some people diet to improve the nutritional intake, their amount of fruit and veg or fibers that they take each day. It's also a support network and strategy. And that support network is particularly relevant and important when we implement a new diet and whether the diet meets expectation. The motivation to follow the diet, some are here. We know that some people, so weight with circumference, heart health, kidney health, liver health, pancreas, wanting to maybe enjoy more regular eating patterns, stopping snacking, stopping eating out of home, quality of life, strengths, sleep quality and well-being, a lot of different reasons on why to diet. Similarly, there's different type of diet interventions. Some focus on supplementation, so increasing vitamin C or zinc or a certain type of fat, polyphenolics. Some will focus on single foods, so there is a lot of evidence about, for example, blueberries or coffee or specific soups and shakes. Some diets focus on dietary patterns, so the Mediterranean diet, the Nordic diet, the vegetarian diet with good evidence base. We've got some hypocaloric diet, so traditional low-fat diet. We've got some hypo or isocaloric diet, So for example, the low carb diet, which is rising in popularity in the last 10 years. And we've got approaches which are called total diet replacement, where you remove all foods and you reboot the diet with shakes and soups for a period of time, generally with low caloric intake, and then go back to food gradually. And finally, we've got time restricted eating, fasting patterns, for example, the 5-2 diet and so on. So a lot of information out there, a lot of different style of diet, and it's very difficult to kind of find a way through that evidence and through this information, which makes it really, really tricky to pick something that works. And ultimately, it's hard to find something that works because we're all very, very different. There's a massive variability in responses to diets in people compared to, let's say, your experimental animal, your mouse in a lab, which shares a genetic profile with a neighboring mouse, housed in a similar condition, controlled environment. We are all very, very different. And this dramatically impacts on our ability to follow diet and gain benefit from it. So in terms of the differences, well, first of all, there's our environment. So some of the environmental factors include aspects such as kitchen setup, cooking skill, desire to engage in diet, having a goal, liking food, eating space, being able to follow a plan, access to digital strategies and skills, culture, money, time to prepare food, time scarcity is a big thing, access to shops around you, having dependence or not, having suitable ability to go shopping, well-being, mental health, cognitive skills. Preparing food is complicated for many people, having a supportive network, access to the media and to education, and those are going to influence what we can do quite dramatically. In parallel, we also have our biological factors, and some of those include satiety, appetite, genes, medication, or fingerprint, so everything that is epigenetic, sex and gender, age, disabilities, the microbiome, which plays a role in how food is processed, metabolism in general, hormones levels, micronutrient status, and response to nutrients. So if we consider all those factors, we can see that if I respond well to the diet, there's no given that it will work for someone else, because all those circumstances will make the diet very, very specific in terms of the reaction it triggers in me, metabolically, but also socially. So I wanted to, here we go, to show you a specific study that really shows this variability very well. So this is the Devrock2 study, and this is an inter-individual variability study looking at glucose response in people with type 2 diabetes. So the researchers, that's the team of Nicola Guess, selected 12 women all with type 2 diabetes, and those women were provided with diets, foods for 6 days, and there was 5 different menus, varying from 10% of carbohydrate to 30% of our carbohydrate. So that's quite low in general. That is very low, this is quite low. All the 5 menus contain 15% of the energy afforded by protein, so protein was stable. And this was for a duration of 6 days, during which they wore those kind of patch for continuous glucose monitoring. So glucose was measured all the time. And when we look at that study, we can see here that we've got on the y-axis the mean 24-hour glucose concentration, okay? And we've got here 5 different treatments, 10% carbohydrate, 15, 20, 25, and 30% of the energy coming from carbohydrates. And what's particularly striking is well, there's no difference. Whether it's 10% or 30%, no real difference in mean 24-hour glucose concentration. But what is also similarly striking is the massive variability that we see for each of those plots. Okay, so for each plot, a dot is a person. We can see that they distribute quite widely, whether it is on the very low dose or the 30% higher dose here. And it's possibly better shown here. So here we've got a 10% carbohydrate plot, so very low carbohydrate diet with 15% protein. And we can see that here, each plot, each column is a person. Each line is here the breakfast, the lunch, the dinner, and each color is a day. So we can see that, for example, for this person, we've got quite a tight response. Every day is pretty much the same, okay? Whereas for this person, between days, although the diet is standardized, should elicit the same response, we've got a lot of variability. So the body not responding the same way in the diet at that specific time compared to that person. So we see that variability at 10% carbohydrate, and we see the same at 30% carbohydrate, same level of variability. So there's many ways we could look at that. Those people have got type 2 diabetes, which is a disease that progresses differently between people. They might have been diagnosed at different time. We know as well that things like sleep can impact on the way the body handles glucose, but it's quite striking that basically there is so much variation between people, and it makes us think more carefully about how we run diet trials, especially when we think about weight management or management of things like glucose, which are important for certain diseases. And the use of those plots, those are called waterfall plots. And it shows that for any specific diet, so here we've got the low-fat diet and the low-carb diet, we can see the weight change after the diet for each individual person. So each bar is a person. So those are all people who benefited from the diet, losing anything from very few kilos to up to 30 kilos. But those are people who gained on the diet. The diet didn't work for them. And we can see it's pretty much the same thing, whether it's low fat or low carb. For some people, it works, but for some others, it doesn't. And really, it illustrates how much it's not so much what you eat, but it's whether it agrees with you. Because really, a diet works when you like the diet, you like the food, you feel full, satiated. You've got a goal in mind, a diet enables you to get to that goal, and it potentially asks for redefining a relationship with food which is suitable with the context. So it shows this variability quite nicely. So a question is, when we select a diet, should we be led by the evidence or best fit into lifestyle and circumstances? And that's a tricky one, because no one can really tell how an individual will respond to a diet. So the best diet is the one that you can stick to. And in this study, we can see how diet experiences vary. So in the context of low carb diet, we carried out a cross-sectional survey of people who followed or had followed a low-carb diet in the past. So we interviewed 700 and something people, and 330 of them were either past or current low-carb diet followers. On the top panel, we can see the current followers and how they rate their symptoms. So they see an improvement mostly in all of those, or are not aware of any change. And when we look at the experience in the bottom panel of the past follower, we see a different picture. So this makes sense. If you don't enjoy a diet, like those people seem to have struggled with, you would stop the diet, would stop following it. But the key question is, if you're diet naive, you've never done that diet, how do you make a choice? Where do you start? Will you be in that panel or in that panel? How should you choose? And I think we think about diet as having the choice as potentially being a better thing, or at least that's what I thought when I started looking into it. But the evidence on that is a little bit more complicated. So does having choice mean that you're likely to have a greater success? So if I told you, well, you can have a low carb diet or low fat diet, would choosing make it better? And this is a trial by Yancey that answers that question. So they compared low carb diet and low fat diet over 48 weeks. And they looked at weight, and we can see that here we've got weight registered over that time. But they gave people either a choice of going on low carb or low fat, or they made them, okay? And when we look at the blue red lines, which are either choice, no choice, and the two different diets, we see that there's no great difference. So in that study, it tells us, well, actually, there's no great difference into being given a choice or not. And this is partly replicated in that study by Cole et al. And here we can see that we've got two different groups. So we've got no choice here. So men with no choice, men with choice, women with no choice, and women with choice. Okay. And we can see that there is no massive difference except for this line. And it tells us that men do better when they're not given a choice, which I thought was quite interesting, a gender difference here. But ultimately, no choice is better for men, and there's no massive difference there's no massive difference otherwise. So choice does not impact on adherence to success per se. So that's quite interesting. It doesn't put us any further on how to choose a diet for life and what works. And in fact, if we look at this meta-analysis by Gay et al., we can see that they compared all those different diets. So they synthesized the literature to understand all those different diets using something that we call network meta-analysis. So this is this type of web where they compare what's available in the literature and makes assumption on the comparisons that are not there. And they looked at the difference between the diet in terms of weight loss, blood pressure, blood lipids, and inflammation compared to the usual diet. And we can see that in green, we've got a lot of certainty that there is a superiority. So with the deeper color associated with higher certainty. So for example, we can see that the Atkins diet leads to a weight loss of about 5 to 6 kilo, and there's quite high certainty, whereas the certainty for blood lipids and inflammation is not great for any of the diets. There's no good evidence out there for that. This is a result at 6 months. So 6 months on the diet, which is not very long because here we want to think about lifelong dietary patterns. At 12 months, however, weight reduction diminished for all diets, and improvement in the cardiovascular risk marker mostly disappeared, with the exception of the Mediterranean diet and its positive impact on low density lipoprotein. So this was the only diet surviving at 12-month mark. It does not necessarily mean that all those diets are a little bit weak or a bit rubbish. It just means that the data available is not very good, because doing long-term diet study costs a lot of money, and there's not necessarily all the information out there. So should we bother with diet? Do diets only yield small effect on weight and markers of diseases? Is it a bit too much of a faff? Well, not necessarily. There is something that has shown to be very successful in recent years in specific context, and this is the DIRECT study. So this is my colleague Mike Lean at the University of Glasgow, and he led this trial, which is called DIRECT, which is a diabetes remission trial, which looked at total diet replacement in people living with type 2 diabetes with two key primary outcomes. The first one, weight, and the second one, HbA1c, which is a marker that we use in type 2 diabetes. So the first step in that trial was total diet replacement. So total diet replacement is when the participants who are living with type 2 diabetes and obesity were put on 12 weeks of shakes and soups with low energy density, so 800 and something kilocalories, all balanced with micronutrients, all followed with a dietitian. This was followed by 2 months of food reintroduction with the dietitian, learning how to rebuild meals, build a diet with continued physical activities through walking mostly. And this was followed to 24 months with a weight maintenance phase. So throughout support by the dietitian with relapse management. The aim of the study was to look at weight and HbA1c. Here we can see the change in body weight through that intervention. We can see a very rapid weight loss for the people who did complete the trial, but not so much for the people who struggled to complete. It's quite a difficult protocol. So a striking weight loss of 10-15 kilos, which is then maintained for the completers. And when we look at the proportion of people who achieve 15 kilos of weight loss or more, we can see that it's quite a significant proportion in the intervention, and obviously not so many in the trial. So after 1 year on that program, 24% of the people achieved a weight loss of 15 kilo or more, and this decreased to 11%-ish at 2 years. But what was particularly important is that diabetes remission occurred in nearly half of the people after 1 year and about 35% at year 2. So that's particularly important in terms of impact, because diabetes is a disease that is not always easy to manage and has got a big impact on quality of life. So changing diet radically has got the potential to make meaningful change for diseases such as this one. And here we can see a different plot that tells us the percentage of people who achieved remission at either 1 year in orange or 2 years in red, according to the amount of weight that was lost. So we can see that the higher the weight loss, the higher the proportion of remission. So for the people who only lost 5 kilos or less, the remission was not that great, but did increase as the weight loss went up. So we're applying this similar approach now onto a different clinical setting. We're studying long COVID. So this is just a very short plug to our new trial, applying the same total diet replacement. And here we're looking at whether managed weight loss has got the potential to rapidly improve symptoms associated with long COVID in people living with both long COVID and overweight and obesity. So this is led by myself and my colleague, Dr. David Blade in primary care. So we're hoping to start recruiting very soon and tell you more about it, maybe next year, if all goes well. So a little summary to this part is that diets are complex, and we need to look at them through a socio-ecological lens. And here is a nice example from Nepal, so quite different from Scotland, but still very applicable to what we see here. And we can see that around diet, we've got a lot of constructs and factors that are going to impact on how successful behaviors, dietary behaviors will be. They include capabilities at the individual level, the individual environment, or physical environment, including the food environment, or political environment, or social support, or cultural practices, and our social cultural context with gender construct playing an important role. So ultimately, all those should be taken in consideration when recommending diets or dietary approach to anyone, and we should all check our privileges when we speak about diet. So is there a magic bullet? I don't think there is a magic bullet, but the British media is very, very keen on magic bullets. So we see wine, coffee, chocolate, and blueberries quite often in the news, promising solving oxidative stress crisis, which oxidative stress is not always a bad thing, but there is this sort of narrative in the media. And yes, I mean, those things matter. And in those plant foods, there is something called polyphenolics, which are small bioactive compounds. And there is an interesting evidence base on how those compounds might help us live a healthier life for longer. So here we can see such evidence. So this is data from Denmark, and we're looking at a big diet and cancer and health cohort. So I think, yeah, 56,000-ish people. And we can see risk level, hazard levels for either all-cause mortality, mortality related to cardiovascular diseases, or mortality related to cancer. And we can see that this hazard ratio goes down from very low intake of flavonoids. So flavonoids are a type of bioactive compound that we find in tea, coffee, chocolate, wine, berries. We can see a decrease in risk from 0 to 500, and then a sort of plateau, and we can see it here as well, and here as well. And 500 is the amount of flavonoid per day that about half of the people reach. So half consume less than 500 and the other half would consume more. And it might sound like much, but actually it's not. Is the amount that you would secure from maybe consuming 2 cups of tea, black tea, a couple of squares of very dark chocolate, and maybe a small glass of wine and a few berries. So a combination of those. Flavonoids occur in most plant foods in various levels, and those are particularly rich. So not impossible to reach. However, those associations are mitigated by body weight and things like smoking and total alcohol consumption. So it's very difficult to look at this in isolation to whatever happens elsewhere in life. So do polyphenolics matter? Well, yes, they do, but it's a complex picture because those compounds, they're here. We find them through various foods, processed or not, in various levels. They occur as well alongside fiber, which is going to be in those foods. And the molecules are so big that when we eat them, we're not going to absorb them well. And in fact, they're going to travel all the way through our gut and will go and accumulate in the colon. In the colon, they're going to meet with our gut bacteria, and those bacteria are going to break them down into smaller compounds, which are called the phenolic acid. And those being smaller, they're often better absorbed in a different time scale. So after that initial meal, you will see after a few hours, those molecules increase in plasma and in urine, which means that they will then be able to reach different targets than those that are going to be stuck in the gut lumen. The problem is when we speak about gut bacteria, that we're not all the same. So some people are going to have the bacteria required to break down those polyphenols very effectively. And here, this is a study that we carried out in younger people, age 20-something, and older people, age 50+. And we can see that when we fed the diet, polyphenol-rich diet in younger people, all those phenolic acid, different type of phenolic acid, were present in the urine, showing that the gut of those people were working really effectively to break down the polyphenol and create that nice bioavailable little phenolic acid. However, in older adults, we can see that not everyone was able to kind of metabolize and excrete the phenolic acid, showing that the metabolic machinery was not quite the same. So is it all doom and gloom? I don't think so. It just means that we need to tailor the advice that we give and the recommendation that we make to make sure that they benefit everyone, and that we do not present magic bullets in the same light for everyone, because they may not benefit everyone in the same light at all. We see often that in the news that plant bioactives are safe because they're natural, they come from nature and they can't do any harm. Here we've got an example focusing mostly on caffeine, because it's coffee, it comes back, I think, every so often in a new cycle. But it's a dose that makes the poison. And in the case of polyphenolics, there are some potentially very active molecules that can have toxicity for the liver. And this was the example of a man who had liver health problems following intake of one of those polyphenolic supplements from green tea. And sadly, those supplements are not as well regulated as pharmaceutical drugs, with sometimes quite bad consequences. So everything in moderation remains a very boring message that we repeat, but it does have importance, because in some cases can have some bad consequences. So I'm hoping I'm not running too much of a time. I've got some take-home message, which are quite basic, but nothing that nutritionists say is very exciting. We say very basic things, really. Is that there is a lot of strategies to improve the food landscape that can address nutrient adequacy issues. We talked about food reformulation, health-based health, and how we can improve our food environment for the benefit of everyone. Choice does not necessarily mean greater success or adherence, and sometimes we need to think about it when people go and choose something for themselves. It's not necessarily the better outcome. There's no best diet, only the diet that works, whether it is for weight loss or improving the intake of specific nutrient. And implementation should always consider context, and food affordability is a real problem still in the UK, and it mostly impacts young people who live in families who cannot necessarily afford nutritionally balanced foods. And the best strategies are not limited to strategies focusing just on food and intake. Behavior change is key. Now, I've not had time to speak too much about pregnancy, but pregnancy is a really important time to change behaviors, because at the moment where you've got the responsibility for a new human being, it's a good time to intervene. And there's very little effort put on improving the diet of pregnant mothers, considering the lifelong implication of those diet strategies. And finally, whatever the news say, bioactive might play a role, but those are mitigated by circumstances and physiology. And behind the bioactive media news, there is a very active lobby, which is keen to see the message pushed forward. And the evidence is still very much in its infancy. So a little caution note here. A balanced diet usually will provide you with what you need. Finally, I want to leave you with a slide on research and participating in research. We are always so indebted to our study participants who dedicate their time and energy to join us as study participants. Here we've got 3 surveys that are looking for keen respondents. So if that's something that interests you, please take a photo of the slide, and we'd be pleased to have more answers to those 3 surveys. And if you ever see a trial, nutrition or diet trial coming near you, don't hesitate to take part. It's usually a good experience to kind of learn more about the research process, and it's usually quite fun. Finally, thank you very much for your time and having me tonight. I'm happy to answer any question. And this is a wee picture of Glasgow if you've not been, but I'm sure you know Glasgow. You're not too far.
Emily, that was really interesting. There was an awful lot in there, and I'm sure there are going to be questions. And if people have questions, can you please put them in the chat box? I see things are appearing already. Oops, yep, more than when I looked a second ago. I think you've actually won the competition so far for a number of participants in the audience. So I think you might possibly get more comments, more questions as well. Can I kick off with one maybe?
Please.
Just while a few more come in. And I got one of these lifestyle magazines put through my door the other day with an article in it about Nutrigenomics, which wasn't an expression I'd ever heard before, but basically suggesting you get your DNA tested and that can help determine what sort of diet you should have. And how do you think we should be doing that?
Yeah, so there's 2 big schools. One is Nutrigenetics and one is Nutrigenomics. So Nutrigenomics is more how nutrients are going to impact on your genes and make you react in certain ways. So maybe decrease inflammation or change certain things. Nutrigenetics is, yes, getting your genes checked to tell you what you should do. There's a lot of companies that are offering services that are quite cheap, where you kind of swab the inside of your cheek and send it off to the lab, and they come back and tell you, well, you've got this version of that gene, so you should cut caffeine, and you've got this version of that gene, so you should stop doing that. I think for me, there's 2 problems. The first one is the evidence available. The scientific evidence is very much in its infancy. And those companies are using this weak evidence to make recommendation to people. And my second reservation is that if there was something really alarming in the report that you got, your GP would not necessarily be able to advise much because the science is not there enough. So I think there is a certain risk in looking into that, and it can be quite alarming. And really, when we look, the science is not quite there yet. I think in the future, there is definitely scope to look into that direction, but personalized nutrition is still very much in its infancy. And when it comes to genetic testing, I'm waiting to see if it's got a genuine kind of a benefit. At the moment, I think it's creating potential harm.
Yeah, I did wonder about that. So that's quite interesting.
The other caveat as well is to read the terms and conditions, check how your genetic information is processed and stored, which
yeah, that's a whole other question.
it is.
So we've got a question from Tom Ryan here. If there's no best diet, is it possible to identify a worst diet? And is avoiding bad foods, he's got bad in quotation marks, of course, a good strategy?
So is there a worse diet? Well, yes, it probably is. I think it depends on where you sit and what the worst diet to me is starvation, not having enough food. And I think it's a genuine problem that we refuse to kind of consider it as a diet, but for many children, not having enough food and good quality food is what the diet is like. So to me, this is a worse diet because it's going to create genuine harm potentially for quite a long time in those young people. For adults who have access to maybe plentiful amount of foods, a diet which is deficient is usually not a good thing, especially if it's going to have lifelong metabolic consequences. Avoiding bad food is a good strategy. I guess it depends how you define bad foods. So for example, if you look in the media, often tinned foods are presented as bad and processed, but in fact, tinned food are quite good. They preserve nutrients, they are sustainable, they're cheap. So I think it goes back to this definition of bad food. Is it a nutrient profiling bad food, as in it's devoid of any micronutrient and high in saturated fat and salt and sugar and so on? Or is it a bad food as portrayed sometimes unfairly? And that's where it gets really, really difficult.
So yeah, how good are we at predicting what would work for individuals? Because there seems to be so much variation. Is there a lot of trial and error?
So there is a lot of trial and error, and we know from some of our participants, some of the patients in the trials that in the research trials that they go through a cycle of trying things and some stick and some don't. I think the problem is when you try and fail, there's some sort quickly disappointment that sets in and it dampens your enthusiasm because it's hard and it's not particularly pleasant to not succeed. And that's where really approaches where there is a good support network relying on proper scientific evidence becomes really important. So ideally, everyone would have access to a good registered dietitian or nutritionist, at least, to kind of guide them in making those choices and picking up flags and red flags when they happen. But sadly, we know it's not the case. So, I mean, I guess in my job, I don't advise people on what to do. I'm not a dietitian, I'm a scientist, but my dietetic colleagues do a fantastic job. And if I had a wish, is for everyone to have access to someone like them in the time of need of dietary advice. But yeah, I would say stay clear of special Facebook forums and providers of non-evidence-based advice, and there's plenty out there.
This sort of ties into a question from Wolga Braith, which is related. Since there seems to be scope for individuals to understand that they each have unique diet health needs and to learn what works best for them personally, and that so following any kind of standard diet may not be personal enough to make a difference. So is such a personal approach too anecdotal to suit rigorous scientific research?
So, I mean, there's more and more, there's a new research design, which is called the N of 1 study, where each person is studied as its own unit, and symptoms are studied when they go on a diet and off a diet, or change diet and change treatments. Sadly, the evidence is not quite there on that. It's quite a new study design, and we've not seen a lot of studies coming out with findings yet, but it seems to be the next step in our research world to look at those N of 1 study and be able to kind of draw conclusion to tailor. But ultimately, for the person at home wanting to choose diet is quite difficult because you don't always know your needs. A lot of people don't know that there are maybe insufficient in specific nutrients, for example, and they wouldn't know if they wouldn't be aware. And we know that it's the case for iodine. Iodine is not something that people know about. However, if they were planning a pregnancy, you would hope that they would be aware of it and would identify that maybe they avoid milk and fish and do not get enough, but we know that it's not the case. So I think it's a combination of education and access to diagnostic tests, but we're not quite there yet.
Yeah, I was wondering actually whether we should, I don't know what gets taught in schools these days, to be perfectly honest. I certainly found that domestic science when I was at school wasn't particularly enlightening. But do you think we should be teaching more of what is good diet in schools?
Yeah, I think that's particularly important. So my daughters are 9 and 12. So the little one in P1 does a bit of health and well-being. The way diet is taught is, I think, is still full of stigma and full of wrong messaging, and that's a bit concerning. So for example, the good and bad food, it works in a research context, but I don't think children should be taught about this kind of very dichotomized good and bad, because it depends on the context, but they do a little bit of it. At secondary school, my eldest does do a bit of home economics, but it's not really focusing so much yet on nutrition. I'm hoping that it will come, but yeah, we'll see.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing, because I would have thought it could tie into biology and chemistry lessons as well. And
yeah, I'm not sure how tied the topics are, but
no. Okay. David Bowler, who's an archaeologist, says he's been reading about the diet of native peoples around Hudson's Bay in the 18th century, and it sounds dreadful. But it's often said that Mesolithic hunter-gatherer diets are good for you.
So yes, there's a lot of evidence on the Paleolithic diet, which was quite popular a few years ago. I think it still is to some extent. It's a low-carb diet. I guess lifespans were quite different back then, and I'm not sure the kind of non-communicable diseases were as prevalent in the population back then. But when we look at the data from people following those type of diets, we can see that it's very good for some nutrients. For example, folate, vitamin A, very high, but for other things it's not so good. So for example, magnesium can be quite low. Now, I guess if you lived up to, let's say, 40 years of age, maybe a magnesium insufficiency wouldn't have time to have impact on certain metabolic aspects as it would now when you can live to 90 plus years old. So I think there's a real danger in saying, oh, well, the people back then did it like that. Let's replicate it in our modern world where we live so much older and are so much less physically active as well. I think that's something to also think about.
Mm. An interesting question from David Thistlethwaite. Over the last 50 years, the quality of common British foods has deteriorated. And this is mirrored by a deterioration in Britain's soils, which we work very hard. Do we need to involve the agricultural industry in helping to improve our nutritional health? Is this already happening?
So last year, UKRI, which is the research funding body in the UK, funding a batch of studies looking at the food system. So they were looking to fund studies that were going to go beyond just food, but looking at producers, retailers and consumers, and bringing everyone together. And one of the stakeholders in those projects were farmers, and looking at the quality of the soil and the local economy. And I think in the UK, there is an increased kind of awareness about the role of soil quality in food quality. Obviously, a slightly dampened by the fact that a lot of our food is imported. So it would depend on the quality of the soil wherever the food was produced. But if we focus a little bit more on local foods and local circles, then the soil becomes even more important in the quality of the food that we produce. So those projects should have just started this year, and we would expect to see results on that type of research in the coming 2 or 3 years. So that's definitely a space where the UK research bodies are investing at the moment.
Well, that's good to hear, and it would be nice to hear the outcomes of that sometime in the future. Another question, given the nutrient deficiency research that showed some quite extreme deficiencies for teenagers, how can this be combated? What can we do for them? So
teenagers is I mean, you probably all know what teenagers are like. It's not an easy group to work with. And I think for food, it comes at a time where seeking independence is really important. So the parental role and the parental potential in redressing the diet is actually quite limited, because it's not an age where children like to be redressed or put into a specific frame. It's also impacted as well by the fact that a greater and greater prevalence of young people are living with overweight and potentially as well obesity in Scotland and in the UK. So I think there's a role to be played by schools and education institutions in producing a good menu and a good food landscape for those people. So for example, we know that food standards in Scotland are good. Secondary schools adhere to them, but there's always a problem that children don't necessarily stay in school for lunch and go down to Greg's to buy a pasty instead of a balanced lunch. So it's really thinking about our food environment, regulation on the food landscape, thinking about food vendors around schools, and providing healthy, nutritious alternative as part of the school menu to kind of mitigate the problem that we see. It's also a period of steep growth, so those nutrients are important.
Yeah, I have to admit, I was one of those who went to the shop for a sausage roll or something at lunchtime with school.
I think everyone did. It's also a time where you think you're invincible.
Yeah, very true.
So,
okay, here's from Tom Ryan, who I think worked in Japan for some years. Is there a nutritional reason for the lack of overweight people and the very high number of centenarians in Japan?
There's some nice data from Okinawa and the centenarians. So there's hypothesis looking at animal protein, fish protein, green tea consumption. There's been a lot of different studies, and it's potentially a combination of genetic factors, which account for quite a lot in someone's kind of health trajectory, and the food environment, which is not so obesogenic in Japan compared to the UK. So especially in rural part of the country, you would not see the same density of fast food outlets and out of home kind of catering companies that you find here. So the combination of both seems to be the answer.
So do you think we should be regulating fast food outlets more, or just educating them to produce better food?
So the regulation, it's a planning issue, and I think some councils are looking into that. But ultimately, I mean, it's a local business. I don't know how much regulation you can have. In terms of what they do, there is some recommendation coming on portion size and what portion size can be served that would go some way into modifying the amount of energy people take from those outlets. I guess the problem is not so much, let's say, in the west end of Glasgow, where you've got maybe your Waitrose and next to it fish and chip shops, because you have a choice technically. The problem is more when you go in places in Lanarkshire where 100% of the food outlets around you are chip shop, chicken shops, and there's not actually an outlet which sells what I would call proper food. But it's very stigmatizing to say proper food like that, but food that I would say is unprocessed and ready to cook.
Yeah, a lot of that comes down to what people can afford as well, doesn't it? Okay, we have a question about, in the UK we've got a health service which is free at the point of use, and you might think this doesn't encourage people to take responsibility for their own health. So coupling that with the lack of public education on the link between nutrition and health, we have a a reasonably sick society who don't always realise how much they can help themselves. Do you have thoughts on how we can do that better?
I think I do agree that people are not necessarily aware on how much they can change things, and that's a problem that comes with education. We talked about schools and general kind of knowledge about food and nutrition, which is not really there. It also comes from families. If parents don't cook and don't teach children what's in food and how to kind of prepare a meal that is healthful, then it's problematic, and families need supported. It's an investment, and I think it's unfair that government puts responsibilities on the individual to educate themselves when the structures of our world do not necessarily allow people to educate themselves, especially on the topic which is so controversial, when you've got like big conglomerates and celebrities kind of spouting information which is not always true. There's a lot of false prophet on that topic. But in terms of the NHS being free at the point of care, I think it's a good thing. And I think something that always worries me is when we hear things like a two-tier system for people maybe living with obesity, having inflicted it on themselves and then should suffer the consequences of not being able to access this free at the point of use healthcare, because there's a lot of stigma around obesity. People who are living with obesity don't inflict it on themselves. Obesity is recognized as a disease, and not everyone is metabolically made the same, and their response to that environment that we've got, which is obesogenic, is going to be very different. Some people are fortunate that they can continue to live with a healthy body weight regardless of the number of fast food outlets or treats in front of them, don't feel the impulsion to eat them. That's not true for everyone. So I think it's important to recognize that not everyone chooses to be living with overweight or with obesity. It's a condition.
Yeah. I think there's quite a lot of research just now as well into microbiomes, isn't there? And the impacts that might have on our weight and our general health. Do you get involved in that at all?
So we do some microbiome research, and again, for a few tens of pounds, you can get your microbiome sequence, and the company will tell you stuff about it. What it truly means is not entirely clear. It's from a research point of view, super exciting to look at all that diversity and try to understand what it means. What we know is that different makeup of gut bacteria will potentially influence things like inflammation. That's really important. And there's some easy things that we can do to modulate our gut bacteria beyond what is already preset. Things like increasing fiber intake. Now the fiber recommendation is 30 grams per day. Very, very few people manage that. It's a very high target. Most people are around 10 grams per day in the UK. To reach 30 grams per day, you need to eat a lot of baked beans and a lot of breakfast cereal, whole grain breakfast cereal stuff. But that alone has got a massive impact on the gut microbiome and how it's able to kind of dampen inflammation that might be there and potentially benefit health long term. But yeah, it's not easy. Fiber is hard to get. Probiotics might work as well if you take them for long enough.
Right, thank you. And last question, I think, from Gordon Freeman. Is there any benefit in so-called organically produced food?
So there is no evidence showing a difference between conventional and organic foods on health outcome in humans. So all trials have shown no difference at all, but there is definitely an impact on the land, the way things are farmed. And if you believe that the quality of the soil will then impact your environment, and we're not just talking about the crop that grows in it, but we're talking about pollinators as well, that will then be useful to create crops elsewhere, then maybe that kind of way of growing crops is going to be important in creating that healthy food system. So a food system that's not just healthy for the people, but healthy for the environment, and the healthy environment in turn impacting on the people living in it. So it's not a bad thing, but on health only, no evidence as yet.
That's interesting. Thank you. So I think that's our last question for the moment. Thank you very much for that. But I'm going to hand you over to David Bowler for a more formal vote of thanks.
Thank you very much, Claire.
Thank you.
Thank you, Claire. And well, Professor Conway this evening has done, I think, what many of us suspected she might do. She's told us there aren't any magic bullets. She's told us a lot about a subject that affects us all, because nutrition is one of those things that we're all involved in and all have to think about. I think we've learned a lot this evening. We've seen how much more complicated it is than we might have realized. We haven't been given a simple prescription. We haven't been given a simple way ahead, but we've been given lots to think about, and we've been given some tools to help us do the thinking that we all need to do. So thanks very much, Emily. I think it will literally take us a while to digest what you've told us, but I think it will do us good. So many thanks indeed, and thanks for being with us this evening.
Pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you. And I think that's our last talk for this year, David, isn't it?
I believe it is.
So we resume on, oh gosh, I've forgotten, the th of January.
Yes.
Sorry, but we will, obviously, emails will go out to people before then. And that will be Greg Kenneser from the Royal Botanic Gardens, Edinburgh, talking about Scottish plant flora.
Yes.
So again, thank you to Emily and David for doing that. And I think that's us for the evening.